Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto what if stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. Slowly separating myself from Kurama, who had her arms wrapped around me. Finally managing to get free, I carefully climbed out of bed before heading for my bag, getting out a clean pair of clothes. As if sensing my absence from bed, Kurama began to stir before groaning slightly. "Nah?" she asked, cracking an eye open and looking at the bedside clock before letting her head fall back to her pillow. "Do you have any idea what time it is? Come back to bed," she said. And I looked at her apologetically. "Oh. Sorry for waking you, Kurama. You can go back to sleep. I was just going out to train," I said, and her eyes snapped open as she looked at me incredulously. "Training? This early? Can't you wait a bit?" she asked, and I shook my head. "Why is it so important that you train right this minute?" she asked, and I hesitated for a minute before sighing. "Well, if I'm supposed to be your mate, I'd rather not be a failure," I said. And she looked at me in surprised confusion. "AF what? Where's that coming from?" she asked, and I frowned. "Oh. Come on, you know exactly what I mean. I can't even use the Rinnegan right," I said before sighing. "I may not be the brightest person, but even I can see that as I am now, I'm nothing more than an embarrassment," I said, and she frowned, slowly getting out of bed, walking towards me. She looked me in the eyes for a few seconds before slapping me. Not hard, but enough to shock me. "Nah, you are not a failure. Even without the Rinnegan, you've saved and protected the village more times than I can count. The Rasengan isn't the only jutsu, you know. And as for you being an embarrassment, do you really think I care what people think?" she asked, and I frowned. "I guess not. I still want to go training though," I said, and she sighed. "Well, let me just get dressed and we can head out," she said. And I frowned. "You don't have to come with me. Like I said before, you can go back to sleep if you want," I said. And she shook her head and rolled her eyes. "I'm afraid that I do have to go with you. You are the type of person who would train until they pass out, especially when they think they have something to prove," she said, turning toward the bed to collect her clothes. I was about to reassure her that I would be fine before I got a look at her back. Blinking in confusion, I pointed at her back. "Wait, Kurama, what's that?" I asked, and she turned to look at me in confusion. "What's what?" she asked, and I walked over to her. On her back was a mark that was similar to the one on mine. Pointing this out, she immediately went to the mirror and turned around, looking at her reflection. When she saw the mark, she smiled. "It's official," she said, looking happy. "We're officially mates," she said, and I looked at her in confusion. "Wait, I thought that was what the mark you gave me was for," I said, and she frowned. "Well, not exactly. Sure, it marked you as my mate, but it wouldn't take effect until after we consummated it, to which the same mark would then appear on me. With the same mark on me, we are now linked," she said, and I nodded in what I felt was understanding. "I think I get it, but the way you explained it last time, you made it sound like it was already official," I said. And she shrugged. "Well, to me it was. It's just a bit more permanent now," she said. And I looked at her in confusion. "Wait, what do you mean?" I asked, and she sighed. "Think of it this way. Back when you were the only one with the made mark, it could easily be removed if you wanted it to be. Now that we are linked, the mark can't be removed. The only way I understand it coming off is if something happened to me. Similarly, my mark will stay on me as long as you are okay," she said before looking away. "Anyways, enough about that," she said, picking up a pair of her new sweatpants, slipping them on. "Didn't you want to go training?" she asked, finding the shirt she was wearing yesterday and putting it on as well. Nodding, I stepped into my shoes. "Yeah, I guess if you're coming too, we should get going. Actually, it may be a good thing that you're coming along. Those shirts might be ready for you to pick up," I said, and she nodded thoughtfully before setting up her disguise. Once she was ready, we headed out. First, heading into the village to stop by the tailory. Getting a few waves from a couple villages, we finally arrived at the little shop. Opening the door, a bell chimed, signaling our arrival to the woman sitting behind the desk. Looking up, she smiled at us. "Welcome. How may I help you this morning? She asked, and we stepped forward towards the counter. Yes, good morning. We were just stopping by to check if Kurama's shirts were finished, I said, and the woman blinked, pulling out a little book. Kurama, Kurama. I'm not seeing anything on the order list, she said, looking at us with a shrug. It would probably be under Tamari's name, I said. And she once again looked at her list before pointing at a name on the paper. Ah. Yes, here it is. 5 black t-shirts embroidered with the design of a fox on them. Correct, she asked, and Kurama nodded. I just finished them last night, she said before leaning behind the counter and bringing up a stack of shirts. Tamari has already paid for them, so you're free to take them. Just let me get you a bag, she said, getting a bag and placing the shirts inside before handing it to Kurama. There you go. Hope you have a good day, she said, thanking her. We headed out. Walking out of the tailory, I looked at Kurama curiously. Hey, so now that you have your new shirts, do you want to change into one or do you just want to drop them back off at the apartment and go training? I asked and she looked at the bag thoughtfully. You know, as much as I like this shirt, I actually wouldn't mind changing into something a bit more clean, she said, and I nodded, turning towards our apartment. Walking for a bit, we reached the door and I unlocked it before waiting outside while she changed shirts, frowning. She looked at me in confusion. Why are you waiting out there? You've already seen me before, she said, and I rolled my eyes. I thought I'd give you a bit of privacy. You might be perverted enough to not mind me looking, but I'm not like the pervy sage. I actually have enough respect not to watch, I said, having finished changing into one of her new shirts. She walked out, playfully jabbing me in the arm. Oh, really? So when you always tried to peek over the walls of the hot springs at that soccer girl, that was you showing respect? She asked, and I stammered a bit, my face turning red. And I'm not perverted, she said, sniffing indignantly and pouting. Breaking out of my embarrassed stammering fit, I looked at her incredulously. Seriously, as soon as you were out of the seal, you began hinting at what we had done the previous night, I said, and she continued to pout. Hey, I'd just like to see you squirm. It's hilarious, she said in defense. And I rolled my eyes. If you ask me, it's just your true nature showing through, I said, and she pointedly looked away. Yeah, well, just remember who's planning on training you. If I were you, I'd be careful what you accuse me of, she said, playfully sticking her tongue out at me. Quickly beginning to backtrack, I scratched the back of my neck nervously. Hey, I was just making an observation. There's nothing wrong with being perverted. In fact, isn't everyone a bit pervy? I asked, and she continued to stay silent. Sighing, I cleared my throat. Well, anyways, now that you have changed into one of your new shirts, which may I say looks really good, and you, are you ready to head out to the training cave? I asked, and she looked at me for a few seconds with a raised eyebrow before rolling her eyes and shaking her head. Oh, so now you're going to try and butter me up? Ha, well, whatever, let's just head out for the cave, she said, and I breathed a sigh of relief, falling in step with her as she began walking down the steps leading to the road below. As we walked, I looked at Kurama. You know, I wasn't lying when I said that shirt looked good on you, I said, and she looked at me through the corner of her eyes. Yeah, well, thank you, she said before looking at me. Hey, you do realize I was just messing with you, right? I'm well aware of how I can be, she said. And I nodded. I kind of figured that was the case, I said, and she nodded back. Good. Don't feel like you have to be careful with what you say. Okay, she asked, and I smiled. Content with my response, she remained quiet. And we continued on our way. Reaching the cave, we looked around before entering, Kurama taking the lead. Making it to the training area, Kurama once again lit the torches before leaning against the wall. Sighing, I took a deep breath. Well, I guess it's time to start training, I said, and she crossed her arms, looking thoughtful for a few seconds as I took my place in the center of the cave. Wait, hold on, nah. I may have a suggestion that could speed up your training, she said, and I quirked an eyebrow in interest. You're familiar with the shadow clone method, right? She asked, and I thought for a few seconds. You mean the technique Kakashi-sensei came up with to help me learn Renshuriken? I asked and she nodded. I'm sure he wasn't the first to come up with it, but yes, that's the one I mean. It helped you learn Renshuriken in theory. I don't see why you can't do the same to learn the basic Renin, she said. And I frowned. That is a good idea, but wasn't the whole point of training that I didn't use shadow clones? I asked, and she sighed, giving a nod. Yeah, I guess that would be counterintuitive. But the way I was thinking, you would have each shadow clone make an attempt without getting help from each other. She said, and I nodded thoughtfully. That might work. So, how many shadow clones would you suggest? I asked and she looked around the cave and thought. Well, I already know you can create a record amount of them, but how about you create 10? That should speed up your training quite a bit without seriously taking up too much room, she said, and I nod. Before throwing together the signs to create the shadow clones. Relaying the plan to each of them, we all went to separate areas of the cave. Taking a deep breath, I began trying to form the Rinnegan. Leaning against the wall and watching me closely with crossed arms, Kurama nodded to herself before pushing herself off the wall and walking over to me a few minutes later. Hey nah, I think I can see what may be causing you trouble, she said, and I blinked, pausing. The shadow clones also stopped what they were doing, quickly turning their attention to her. You seem to have shape and power down, but the rotation seems off, she said. And I looked at her in confusion. Wait, what do you mean? I asked and she sighed. Okay, let's see. The Rinnegan is just regular concentrated chakra. So, she said before holding out her hand, going through the motions of forming a Rinnegan. A few seconds later, a ball of blue energy began to form, and I looked at her in shock. Looking up from the Rinnegan she had created, she grinned. What? Surprised I can use this? She asked, and I nodded. Where do you think your father got the inspiration to make this move? It was based off of the Beiju bomb. Of course, I'd be able to use it. Anyways, look at it. Notice how it's rotating in multiple directions at once? She asked, and I nodded once again. Yeah, I see what you're talking about, but isn't that what I was doing? I asked, and she shook her head. No, you're only making it rotate in one direction. Imagine it like rowing a boat. If you only row on one side, you won't make any real progress. You have to make it spin in multiple directions like mine, she said, and I thought for a few seconds before turning to my clones. Well, you heard her, I said, and they immediately went back to work. Getting back to attempting to form the Renin, I sighed. It's a lot better knowing I don't have to worry about you trying to take over my body, you know. I asked, and she frowned. I won't lie and say I had your best interests in mind, but it wasn't all bad. It did some good, she said, and I looked at her incredulously. Really? How could having to worry about my friend's safety when around me be any good? I asked, and she sighed. Well, for one, your willpower increased. Every time I tried and failed to take complete control of you, you got better at dealing with it. Remember when that Sora kid attacked the hidden leaf taking on my form and I tried to take control? She asked and I nodded. Of course I remember that you almost succeeded, I said, and she sighed. As much as I hate admitting being weak, I tried my hardest that night and you held me back with sheer will and determination, she said, and I nodded slowly, though I still frowned. I guess that is pretty good. Still, I would have liked that a lot more if my friend's safety wasn't on the line, I said, and she stayed quiet for a few seconds before her gaze hardened. Right, enough wasting time talking. Back to training, she said, and I sighed, getting back to what we had come here for in the first place. After about an hour or two, one of the clones let out a cheer, and everyone turned to look at him. Walking over to him, it quickly became apparent that he was holding a successfully made, albeit small, Rasengan in his hand. Giving Kurama a quick glance, I turned to look at the shadow clone. Do you think you could recreate it? I asked, and he nodded, dispersing the ball of chakra before getting back into position and holding out his hand, sticking out his tongue in concentration. His other hand shot out in the motions needed to form the Rinnegan. A few seconds later, a small glowing blue sphere began to form, and within another few seconds, the clone was holding another Rasengan. Grinning, I gave him a nod. Great, thank you for the hard work, I said before dispelling him. The remaining clones blinked, a look of understanding flashing in their eyes. Turning to look at him, I gave them a nod as well. Now that you all have the basic idea of how to create a one-handed ringan, I want us all to work on figuring out how to make it larger. Understood? I asked and they nodded before going back to separate areas. Looking at me, Kurama looked impressed. You know, when I suggested this method, I knew it would speed things up, but not this much. When you really put your mind on something, it truly shows, she said, and I grinned and shrugged. What can I say? This is something that's important to me, I said before bringing my focus back to my task. After about another 2 hours, I had it almost perfected. I was able to successfully form a full-sized ringan. However, it did not come without its problems. What I was able to form looked correct, but I seemed to have trouble sustaining its form for very long. After about 10 seconds, it seemed to just blink out. After trying for a few more minutes, Kurama frowned and placed a hand on my shoulder. Looking at her for a few seconds, I sighed, straightening up. Come on, nah, let's get back to the apartment, she said, and I nodded, turning towards my clones. Thanking them, I released the jutsu. Taking a step forward, I nearly passed out as the exhaustion of my work and my clones' work finally hit me. Whoa, Kurama said, grabbing me and keeping me steady. I'm getting closer to mastering it, I said tiredly, and she nodded, rubbing my shoulders. You're right, a little more practice and you'll have it down. But for right now, let's just get you home. You could use the rest, she said. And I couldn't hold back a yawn. Focusing her chakra, she put out the torches before leading me out of the cave, letting me lean against her. Making it to the village, I looked at Kurama. Hey, thank you, I said. And she looked at me in confusion. Thank you for what? She asked, and I sighed. Just thank you, I said, and she looked at me for a long few seconds before smiling slightly and nodding. Walking down the streets towards our apartment, I slowly shook my head. You know, I still don't understand what you see in me. Looking back, I was such a whiny kid, I said. And she actually chuckled, nodding. You aren't wrong there, you really were. But you've matured. You've matured from that whiny brat that used to drive me insane to someone who actually gave a crap about making sure I was comfortable, she said, trailing off with a sigh, causing me to look at her in confusion. You know, I've been around since the Sage of Six Paths era, and I've never met a human willing to do something like that, so yeah, excuse me for being quite fond of you. Nodding, I looked forward, beginning to feel well enough not to have to lean against her anymore. Hey, random question, but besides their hatred, why do you hate the Hidden Leaf so much? I asked, and she frowned slightly, scratching her arm. Well, can you really blame me? When you're viewed as nothing more than a weapon, that tends to happen, she said, and I sighed, nodding in understanding. Yeah, I guess I can relate, I said, and she wrapped an arm around me, giving me a sympathetic look. Hey, now let's stop with this depressing talk and get inside. Okay, you could really use the rest, she said, giving me a smile, and I nodded as we walked towards the apartment building. Making it to the steps, I began to climb the first step before pausing, a look of concern on my face. What is it? Kurama asked, and I held a finger up to get her to be silent for a few seconds. Do you sense that? I whispered, and she looked at me for a few seconds with a frown before rolling her eyes. No, nah, I don't sense a, she began before her frown deepened. Wait, I sense leaf ninjas, she said, and I nodded, creeping up the steps. Reaching the top, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Climbing up behind me, Kurama looked at the door before looking at me. Swallowing, I reached for my kunai and slowly crept inside, fully prepared for a fight. Kurama right next to me. Kurama and I crept up the stairs. Noticing the door was slightly ajar, I took a deep breath, all my muscles tense and prepared for a fight. Looking back at Kurama, I nodded before gently pushing on the door, causing it to open farther. Taking another deep breath, I stepped inside. From around the corner, I could sense there were at least 5 ninjas. Pausing for a few seconds, I frowned slightly, trying to get a better sense of who was inside. I could tell that they were from the Leaf, but besides that, I couldn't tell who they were. Whoever they were, they seemed familiar. Shaking it off, I steeled myself once again before taking a step forward. Or at least I would have if I were able to move. Neither my arms nor my legs seemed to respond to my attempts to move them. Kurama, who had stopped right next to me, looked at me in confusion. Hey, what's the holdup? She whispered, and I looked at my feet, noticing a shadowy line coming from around the corner. Confused as to why I wasn't moving, she went to put her hand on my shoulder. Wait, I tried to warn her, but it was too late. Placing her hand on my shoulder, our shadows merged, and the shadowy line connected to her shadow as well. Flinching slightly, she realized that she was caught as well. Realizing that we were already noticed, I sighed. Who's here? I called, and for a few seconds there was only silence before someone began to come out from around the corner. Nah, they asked, and I quickly recognized who it was. Shikamaru, what are you doing here? I asked, and he released his jutsu, allowing us to move once again, gesturing for us to follow him to where I assume the others were. Looking at Kurama, I shrugged before we followed him around the corner. As we stepped into the living area, I was surprised to see Choji, Ino, Akamaru, Ka, and Hinata. Looking up from her place on the couch, Hinata blushed when she saw me. Nah, it's good to s, she began before Ka jumped up. Nah, we were starting to worry that you had already moved on. How have you been? And who's the girl? Your girlfriend? He asked, cutting Hinata off. Upon hearing this, Hinata flinched slightly, clearing my throat nervously. I looked at Kurama. Why, yeah, I guess you could say that, I said, and everyone looked at me in shock. Guys, this is Kurama, I said, gesturing to her while she gave a slight nod, uninterested now that everything was deemed safe. Shikamaru suddenly looked thoughtful. Kurama, why does that sound familiar? He asked, and I looked around nervously. I think my father mentioned a name like that before. Back when he was telling me about the day, he began before his eyes widened and he looked at Kurama sighing. I looked at her and gave her a nod. Grinning, she stepped away from the wall. It's about time. I was beginning to get tired of holding that disguise. She said, lifting her hands up in front of her and releasing the jutsu, a cloud of smoke filling the air. As the air cleared, everyone tensed when they saw her. Seeing their reaction, she chuckled. As much as I love seeing all of your terrified expressions, relax. I have no intentions of causing any trouble, she said. Yeah, and why should we believe a word you say? Ka said, positioning his hands in preparation in case Kurama tried anything. And she only rolled her eyes. For one, I don't exactly have all my power, she said before glancing my way. Also, I doubt Naruto would appreciate me killing his friends, she said. And Shikamaru relaxed slightly before frowning. So, it's true. Lady Sununit said, you two seemed close, but for you two to be together like this. Is that why you released the seal? He asked, and I looked at him in surprise. Is that what you think? Do you really think I would release the seal just like that? I didn't release the seal, I said, and he frowned again. Then how did the Ninetales escape? That seal was placed by the fourth Hokage, he said, and I looked away, not meeting anyone's eyes. Sensing my uncomfortableness, Kurama rolled her eyes. I was able to get loose because of a loophole that only high-level Begis would be aware of. Being the queen of the Begis made it easy, she said, and Shikamaru looked interested. Before he could ask any more question, however, I jumped in. So, what are you all doing here? I hope you're not here to bring me back to the village. I said quickly, seeing what I was trying to do. Shikamaru just sighed before shaking his head. No, we aren't trying to bring you back, he said, placing his hands in his pockets. After you haven't been seen in the village since your birthday, I decided to check up on you, except by the time I got to your house, you were already gone and your house was empty. I asked Lady Sununit if she knew where you were and she said you had been exiled. He said and Ino nodded. Yeah, we didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. When we heard that you had been exiled, we were worried about you, she said. And Kurama scoffed, right. Because you sure care about Naruto on his birthday, she said before going on. It's funny. Someone who's given him so much trouble was the only one who was there while all of his so-called friends avoided him like the plague. She said, and I shot her a sharp look. Kurama, I'm sure they just had things they needed to do. As for you being there, you couldn't not be. You were sealed inside of me. I said, after a few seconds, I noticed that the others were being silent. After another few seconds, Hinata sighed. As she's not wrong, she said, and I looked at her in surprise. So you all were avoiding me? I asked, and she looked down, nodding. I sighed, looking away. I get it. I guess it would be hard to look at me the same on that day, I said before shaking my head and changing the subject. So how are things in the village since I left? It hasn't been that long, but a lot can change in a few days, I said, and Hinata frowned. And Naruto, she began with sadness in her eyes before she was interrupted once again. Lady is getting the others to drive you away if they see you. She said that she gave you the chance to return, but you chose not to. I don't understand why you would turn down the chance to come back. Shikamaru said, and I sighed. Think about it. Now that Kurama is free, there's no way I could return. A lot of people lost friends and family in that attack. Nobody would be able to accept us, and I wouldn't expect them to. And if I didn't make it clear before, I'm not going anywhere without her. I said, gesturing to Kurama. Looking at me for a few seconds, Shikamaru sighed and nodded. I guess I could see your point. So, what do you plan on doing? I don't know if you realize this, but you can't stay here permanently when you're a rogue ninja. You may be friends with Gar and he may be the Cease Cage, but he still answers to the Land of Wind's feudal lord, and when he catches on to WH. It is going on, there will be nothing Gar can do to let you stay. He said, and I nodded. I'm aware of this. Gar gave us a week to stay here. I have a good idea of where I plan on going next, but in the meantime, for the remainder of the week, I plan on training and helping around the hidden sand. I said, and Shikamaru nodded in understanding. At least you have a plan and aren't just charging forward like you used to do. He said before sighing and looking around. Well, we should get going back to the Leaf before Lady Sununit gets angry. Listen, all of us are trying to change her mind about getting us all to chase you away. Hopefully, you'll be able to stop by the village again one day, he said, and I nodded as everyone began to stand. Hopefully, part of my plans will involve having to go through the Land of Fire and well have to me pretty close to the village as we pass by. I said, and Shikamaru raised a brow. Really? Where exactly are you planning on going? He asked, and I sighed. Just to pay a visit to some old friends of Team 7 near the Hidden Mist. After that, we'll officially drop off the radar. I said, and he frowned slightly before nodding. Well, it was nice seeing you again. Nah, glad to see you're okay. He said before leading the way to the door. Hey nah, Hinata asked as the others exited the apartment. Sighing, I looked at her questioningly. Looking away for a few seconds, she seemed to gather her nerve. Are you two really together? She asked, and I frowned. Yes, we are. Why? I asked, and she flinched slightly, looking saddened before giving a weak smile. Oh, and no reason. I was just wondering. I'm happy for you, too, she said, turning and making her way out the door. Watching her go, I shook my head in confusion. Well, that was weird. Then again, Hinata's always acted a bit weird, I said. And Kurama nodded before sighing. She likes you, she said. And I looked at her in surprise. What? No, I said, and she nodded. Judging by how broken up about us being together she was, I'd say she's liked you for a while. She went on, and I frowned. That certainly would explain her behavior whenever she was near me. So, what are these plans you came up with? You never told me about any plans, she said. And I sighed. Well, like I said to Shikamaru, I plan on stopping by and visiting a few friends near the Hidden Mist. As for the other plans, you mentioned that I could possibly learn Sage Mode in the Land of Tofu. So, I was thinking we could go there, I said, and she looked thoughtful for a few seconds before throwing herself on the bed. That certainly sounds like a good set of plans for the time being, she said before stretching. Well, are you getting in bed or are you just going to stand there? She said, letting out a yawn. Looking out the window, I shook my head. Actually, it's not that late and I'm not that tired. I may just go back out, I said, and she frowned, sitting back up. Really? I guess I can put off that nap for later. Where did you want to go? She asked, and I once again shook my head. No, you get some sleep. I'll go out by myself, I said, and she looked at me in confusion, concern etched on her face. What? Why? Are you okay? She asked, and I nodded. Yeah, I'm okay. I just need some time alone. Plus, I doubt you'd want to do charity work around the village. I'm going to check if anyone needs any help, I said, and she looked at me for a few seconds before sighing. All right, if you're sure you're okay, she said, and I nodded again. Don't worry, I'll be back soon, I said before heading for the door. The whole time, I could feel her worried gaze on the back of my neck. Exiting the apartment and closing the door, I sighed, looking around the village. For it still being fairly early, there was surprisingly hardly any people around. Wiping my forehead as the heat immediately hit me after being inside, I guessed that the heat was the main reason for the seemingly empty streets. Sighing, I began heading for Gar's office, seeing if he may have any work for me. Reaching the building in the center of the village that served as the town hall, I took a breath before opening the doors and stepping inside. Walking down the hallway, I soon came upon the door that marked the case cage's office. In front of it stood Tamari, who as soon as she saw me, waved at me. Oh. Hey Na, are you here to see Gar? She asked, and I nodded. Yes. Is that okay? I asked and she nodded. Of course. Let me just let him know you're here, she said before turning towards the door. Knocking, she cleared her throat. Gar Naruto's here and he wants to see you, she said. And a few seconds later, his voice filtered through the wooden door in confirmation. Giving me a smile, she opened the door, ushering me inside before closing the door behind me. Gesturing towards a chair for me to sit down, he looked at me intently. So, what do you want to talk about, Na? And where's Kurama? He asked. Shush is at the apartment. I needed some time to myself to think about some things, and I was hoping you may have some work I could do, I said, and he frowned slightly, looking thoughtful for a few seconds. What happened? He asked, sounding concerned. And I sighed. Well, I'm sure you're aware of Shikamaru and the others being here just a bit earlier, I said, and he nodded. It turns out that even they couldn't get over the fact that Kurama was locked inside me. They even avoided me on my birthday, I said, and he looked at me in surprise. Really? Are you sure they avoided you? That doesn't really sound like them, he said. And I nodded. I'm sure. Hinata came right out and said so, I said, and he frowned, shaking his head and looking surprised. They didn't really seem like they'd hold that against you like that, but I guess you never really know until it comes up. Well, let's see. It's usually only for the hidden sand Ambu and other hidden sand shinobi, but we could use more eyes to guard the village if you're interested. Nothing much really happens, so it'd be a good time to clear your head, he said, and I nodded thoughtfully. That'd be perfect, I said. So, do I just head for the entrance of the village? Yes, just head there and talk to Kangaroo. He'll tell you what you need to do, he said, and I nodded, getting ready to head out before he called me back. Wait, he said, and I turned around, looking at him in confusion. I've been thinking about how your birthday just went by, and I was thinking about something I may be able to give you, he said. And I went to stop him, but he went on. I know Kurama is no longer inside of you, but can you still feel any of her chakra? He asked, and I continued to look at him in confusion. Yeah, she said that when she escaped, she left behind quite a bit of her chakra. She's even trying to teach me some new techniques that could utilize it. Why are you asking? I asked, and he reached into his desk. Like I said before, I was thinking on what I might be able to give you when I remembered being told about a man who specializes in crafting weapons specifically for Gen Turis. While I fight only using sand, I still thought that that information could be useful. So, I wrote down where he could be found, he said, grabbing a piece of paper and handing it to me. I'm not sure if you'll be in that area in your travels, but if you are and you get the chance, you should check it out, he said. And I looked at the paper where an address was written down. Yeah, this is pretty close to where we are planning to go next. So, we may just check it out, I said, and Gar looked at me in surprise. So, you've already come up with plans. That certainly didn't take that long, he said, and I nodded. It's not much, but I plan on saying goodbye to a few friends of my former team before dropping off the map. Kurama has something cool planned, but I'm not really able to say much more than that, I said, and he nodded in understanding. At least you have an idea of what to do next, he said before sitting back in his chair. Well, if you're interested in the lookout job, you should head out now. I should be getting back to my work, he said. And I stood up. Yeah, thanks for letting me do this job, and thanks for letting Kurama and I stay here for a bit, I said, and he shook his head. Don't mention it, he said, and I gave him a smile before walking towards the door. Opening it and waving goodbye to Tamari, I headed out of the case cage's office and out into the village. The temperature having dropped, more people began exiting their houses, confirming my theory from before. Walking through the village, I eventually reached the stone wall that marked the entrance. Noticing a ladder, I climbed to the top of the wall. Noticing me as I reached the top, Kangaroo looked at me in surprise and confusion. Nah, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be up here, he said. And Maki and a few others looked away from the desert to see what was going on. I asked Gar if there was any work I might be able to do to help, and he said I could help guard the village. I said, and he sighed. Of course, he did. Not that I have anything against you, nah, but this really is something that should be done by Shinobi of the Sand, he said, and Maki rolled her eyes. Oh. Come on, Kankuro. There's no rule stating a non-sand shinobi can't help. If Lord Gar has trust in Naruto, that should be all that matters. Plus, Naruto was a big help during the Akatsuki threat, she said. And Kankuro sighed. Fine, then just stand over here and keep an eye on that June, he said, and I nodded, getting to where I was supposed to. After a few seconds, Kangaroo looked at me in confusion. Why are you even doing this job? Nothing much happens, so it isn't a very interesting job, he said. And I frowned slightly. I needed somewhere I could just think. Plus, like I said when we got to the hidden sand, I don't want to feel like we're freeloading. I'm willing to do any job if it would help, I said. And Kangaroo nodded in understanding. Maki, on the other hand, looked at me in concern. Did something happen? She asked, and I hesitated for a few seconds before frowning again. Just something with who I thought were my friends, I said. And Kangaroo looked at me in surprise. You mean Shikamaru and the others? He asked, and I sighed before nodding. Yeah, it turns out that even they were like the other villagers. They had no problems avoiding me on my birthday, I said. And Kankuro shook his head. Ouch, he said, looking at them. It's hard to believe they'd do something like that. Especially the Hyuga girl. The way she always looked at you, I always assumed she liked you, he said before looking thoughtful. How old are you, by the way? He asked, and I looked at him in confusion. 19. Why? What does that have to do with anything? I asked, and he nodded. Good. I wanted to make sure you were old enough before I gave you any advice, he said, and I continued to look at him in confusion. It's not the best advice, but it works for me. I suggest you stop by the bar near here and get some sake. Alcohol always helps make people feel better, he said, and I frowned. I don't know, I said, not at all confident with my alcohol tolerance. Then again, the idea of dulling my self-pity did sound good. Maybe I will, I said. If you do, just be careful not to drink too much, Maki said, and I nodded before turning back towards the desert, watching the dune like I was supposed to. After about an hour, the sun began to sink, and everyone on top of the wall began to stand. Looking at them in confusion, I turned towards Kangaroo and Maki, who remained sitting. What's going on? I asked, and Kangaroo looked away from the desert and towards me. Shift change. The sun is beginning to go down and shinobi who can see clearly even at night are being switched in. You're free to go now. Thanks for the help, he said, and I blinked. Are you sure? I could stay longer, I said. And he looked at me thoughtfully. Unless you can see clearly at night, I'm sure. Go and relax. I'll let Gar know that you were here and you'll get paid tomorrow for your work, he said, and I shook my head, much to his confusion. Don't worry about any pay. I didn't do it to get paid. I needed to clear my head and repay Gar for letting us stay, I said before standing and stretching. Anyways, if you're sure I can get going, I guess I'll see you tomorrow, I said before climbing down. Reaching the ground, I asked one of the villagers for directions before heading for the bar. Taking's advice. Kurama's pav. Slowly opening my eyes and stretching, I noticed how dark the room had gotten. Looking around, I also noticed that Naruto was nowhere to be seen. Sighing, I got out of bed. Okay. I knew something wasn't right. Quote, I mumbled, putting on my pants and straightening my shirt. Activating my disguise, I went out, keeping an eye out for Naruto. The streets were dotted with random people talking and laughing amongst themselves. And I had to weave between a few people as I headed to where I'm sure Naruto would have been seen. Making my way into the Case Cages building, I walked right up to the door to his office only to be stopped by the Tamari girl from before. Wait, she said, and I thought about ignoring her before turning to look at her, sighing and raising an eyebrow. Gar is in a meeting with the village advisors right now. You'll have to wait until he's finished if you want to talk to him, she said. And I rolled my eyes. Do you think I care about some stupid meeting? No. All I want to know is where Gar sent Na, I said, and she perked up slightly. Oh. If that's all you want, there's no reason to bother Gar. If I remember correctly, Na went to help guard the village at the entrance. She said, and I blinked. Thanks, I guess, I said, and she nodded before looking at me questioningly. Wait, does he have good eyesight in the dark? She asked, and I looked at her in confusion. I don't know. As far as I know, he has average eyesight. Why? I asked, annoyed at this seemingly pointless small talk. Tamari frowned, looking thoughtful. They usually switch shifts when it gets dark to people that can see well at night. If Naruto has average eyesight, he should have been back by now, she said, and I shifted my weight to my other foot, feeling uneasy. Noticing this, Tamari looked at me with concern. Are you okay? She asked, and without answering, I turned and hurried out, leaving her to watch me in confusion. Exiting the building, I hurried for the entrance to the village. Reaching the stone wall, I began climbing up a ladder attached to the stone. Getting to the top, I looked around only to recognize Kankuro, the man in black from before. Hearing someone climb the ladder, he turned. Kurama, what are you doing here? He asked, and I looked around at the people watching the desert. Where's Na? I was told he was here, I said. And Kankuro closed his eyes, letting out a sigh. He hasn't returned yet, he asked before looking at the woman next to him. Have you checked the village bar? He asked, and I looked at him blankly. A bar, I said, and he looked away. Blinking, my blank look turned to rage. You sent him to a bar. Why in hell would you do that? I demanded, and he looked back at me with quite a bit of defiance in his eyes. Why wouldn't I? He looked like he needed it. He had a lot on his mind, he said, and I sighed. So, let me get this straight. You see someone who is going through some kind of mental turmoil and you send them to a bar. I asked, rubbing my eyes. Where is this bar? I demanded, and he looked at me. You don't seem to have a lot of faith in Naruto, he said. And I looked at him in anger. Don't you dare bring faith into this. You seem to forget that I have spent the last 19 years sealed inside of him. I know for a fact that Naruto would try anything if he thought it would help him. Even drink until he passes out. So, I'm only going to ask this once more. Where is this bar? I repeated, and the woman beside Kanaro nodded. When you first head into the village, turn left and you should come across the bar if you keep going straight. She said, and I nodded before turning around. As I went to climb down the ladder, the woman called me back. Wait, Kurama, was it? She asked, and I once again nodded. Is it true that his friends were ignoring him? She asked, and I looked at her in confusion. Is that what was on his mind? I asked, and she nodded, causing me to sigh. Yeah, it's true, I said, and she shook her head. That really is a shame. He seems like a hard-working shinobi. I can't understand why people can't just get past things like whether someone is a genturi, she said. And I looked at her in surprise for a few seconds before grinning slightly and giving a final nod. Climbing down, I jumped the last few rungs, landing on the ground and immediately making my way towards the bar. After making a left and continuing forward like that woman had said, I eventually reached what I assumed was the bar in question. Walking up to the front doors, I took a deep breath before pushing them open and walking inside, the smell of strong alcohol and food filling the air. Looking around, I sighed when I saw the familiar spiky yellow hair belonging to Na, who was sitting at the counter. Walking up to him, I frowned. Na? I asked, and he flinched upon hearing his name before turning around to see who was talking to him. Oh. Hikarama, he said, slurring slightly, a large, goofy grin on his face. Frowning, I sighed once again. Did you actually get drunk? I asked, and he looked down at the glass bottle that was on the counter next to him before trying to hide it. No, he said, and I quickly grabbed the almost empty bottle from him that read Phoenix Fire Sake. Oh. Nah, I said, half under my breath as I read the alcohol percentage. This definitely wasn't a drink for beginners like him. Looking up at the bartender, I glared at him, much to his confusion. How could you sell this stuff to him? I demanded, and he looked at me in confusion. What's the problem? It's alcohol, he said. And I continued to glare at him. I mean, how could you sell something this strong to someone who's never drank before? I snapped, and he gave Na an appraising look. Well, he looks fine to me, he said, and I looked at him in shock. That isn't the point. As a bartender, when you see someone who looks new to drinking and they order something like this, aren't you supposed to warn them that it's strong? I asked, and he sighed, starting to look annoyed. Look, lady, my job isn't to do anything other than get someone's age, sell alcohol, and earn money. If someone doesn't have the common sense to check the alcohol percentage, that's not my problem. Now, either buy something or get out. I have work to do, he said, and I had to resist the urge to deck him. Taking a calming breath, I grabbed Naruto's arm and helped him up. Come on, let's get back to the apartment. Nah, I said, and he began to resist slightly, trying to reach for the bottle that was on the counter. But I'm not finished yet, he said, and I sighed. Trust me. Yes, you are, I said, and he mumbled to himself before nodding. Okay, he said as we began leaving the bar, Na swaying slightly until I wrapped an arm around him to keep him steady. Looking at him as we slowly made our way down the streets, I couldn't help but frown, feeling bad for what was happening to him. Hey, why are you looking so serious? We should be having fun, he said, cutting himself off mid-sentence with a small hiccup. And now that we're no longer a part of a village, we can go on adventures of our own, he said, and I sighed. Nah, why did you go out and get drunk? Was it because of what happened earlier with your friends? I asked, and his goofy grin slowly disappeared from his face. If I hadn't seen how drunk he actually was, I would say he almost looked completely sober. What friends? He asked, and I frowned again. I hated seeing him this way. If you mean those so-called friends who avoided me, you were right. They never were my friends in the first place, he said, and I shook my head. No, I don't think I was right. They came all the way here just to see if you were okay, and they're trying their best to get you to be able to return without being chased away. They might have flaws, but they're your friends, I said, and he just huffed. Walking the rest of the way to the apartment in silence, I helped him up the steps and through the door, helping him into bed. Locking the door behind us, I dropped my illusion before hopping into bed next to him, wrapping my tails around him protectively. Sighing in content, he grabbed one of my tails, causing me to jump slightly. Has anyone ever told you that you're fluffy? He asked, and I glared at him half-heartedly for being rough with my tail before chuckling slightly. No, nah, no one has ever said I was fluffy. Now get some sleep. You need it, I said, wrapping my arms around him and pulling him closer. He just mumbled before slowly drifting off into a drunken sleep. Slowly opening my eyes, I winced, letting out a groan as the sun shone through the windows, causing a sharp pain to go through my head. Sitting up, I instantly regretted it as my stomach seemed to flip. Hopping out of bed, I rushed to the bathroom and leaned over the toilet, immediately getting sick. After staying hunched in front of the toilet for a few minutes, I heard quiet footsteps behind me. Well, I was going to ask you how you were feeling, but I guess I got my answer, she said before walking over and sitting next to me, rubbing my back. Still, how are you doing? She asked, looking at me, concern in her voice. Wiping my mouth, I grimaced. Everything's spinning. What happened? I asked, and she looked at me in surprise. Do you not remember last night? She asked, and I frowned. My thoughts were all jumbled up and my memories were a bit hazy. I remember helping out with watching the village, being told that I could go, but after that everything's a blur, I said, and she sighed, shaking her head. Well, you decided to go to the bar and treated yourself to the highest proof alcohol you could get, she said, getting up and heading into the bedroom area, grabbing something and coming back, only to hand me an almost empty bottle labeled Phoenix Fire Sake. Seeing the alcohol percentage, I couldn't help but to groan again. Did I seriously drink all of this? I asked, and Kurama nodded. By the time I found you, you were already drunk and that was all that was left, she said before sighing. So, do you want to talk about it? She asked while leading me back to bed now that I wasn't getting sick anymore. What are you talking about? I asked, looking at her hesitantly, and she sighed. About why you decided to go get drunk, she said. And I frowned, shaking my head. I'd rather not, I said, laying back down as Kurama shut the curtains before looking back at me. Well, with you having a hangover like you do, you're not doing anything but resting in bed, she said, and I winced at her increase in volume. Sighing, she lowered her voice. Look, I know it was because of what your friends said. You may not think they're really your friends, but they are, she said. And I looked at her in surprise for a few seconds before shaking my head. That isn't what you said before, I said. And she sighed. Yeah, well, I was wrong, she said. And I once again shook my head. Actually, you were right. And I was just too gullible to see the truth, I said, and she looked at me sadly. Nah, she said before wrapping a tail around me. You aren't gullible. Well, maybe a bit, but you weren't being gullible this time. If they weren't your friends, they wouldn't have stopped by to check on you, she said, and I mumbled a bit before rubbing my head due to a splitting headache. Frowning, Kurama got up before heading to the kitchen area and grabbing a cup, filling it up with water. Coming back over and climbing into bed, she handed me the cup before gently pulling me back so that the back of my head was resting against her. Here, drink some water, then try to get some more sleep, she said, giving me a caring smile, and I sighed, gulping down the water. Setting the cup down, I began getting comfortable, before looking up at Kurama, who wrapped her arms around me, bringing the blankets over us. That's it. Just get some more sleep. You'll feel better when you wake up, she said, and I nodded, closing my eyes. Kurama's pav. Watching Na slowly drift off to sleep, I frowned, not being able to help feeling bad for him. Finding out that his friends had been avoiding him had been a hard blow for him enough that he'd went out and gotten himself drunk. Looking over at the bottle of alcohol I had set on my side of the bed, I raised an eyebrow, feeling curious as to what it tasted like. Picking it up carefully, I hesitated before taking a quick sip, my eyes widening slightly. Well, at least it could be said that he had good tastes in alcohol. Licking my lips, I gulped down the rest, not having to worry about the alcohol content due to being a buju. Sighing in content and licking my lips, I set the empty bottle back on the bedside table before once again getting comfortable. Finding a good position, I laid back down, looking down at Naruto, who was now fast asleep. Brushing a lock of hair from his face, I wrapped my arms a bit tighter around him, pulling the blankets over us and bringing him a bit closer. Having nothing else to do, I closed my eyes, deciding to catch some more sleep as well. After what only seemed like a few seconds, I was jolted awake by a knock on the door. Looking at the shadows being cast across the floor, I could tell it had been longer. Looking down at Na, he was still fast asleep. Another knock a few seconds later caused me to sigh, and I slowly slid out of bed, careful not to wake Na. Slowly walking over to the door, I looked out the peephole before opening the door, not worrying about putting up my disguise as I recognized who was on the other side. Opening the door, I raised an eyebrow, coming face to face with the girl from last night. Yes, what do you want? I asked, not in the mood for company. The girl looked at me in surprise for a few seconds before taking a step back. Kurama, she asked, and I realized she had never seen my real form. Sighing, I rolled my eyes. Yes, again, what do you two want? I asked, and nodded. How's Narut? We didn't spot any of you today. And when we asked the bartender, he said a woman dragged him away. He said, and I scoffed, rolling my eyes. Yeah, I had to guide him home after he downed a bottle of Phoenix Fire. He's currently sleeping off a hangover, I said, and they flinched slightly before sighing. We figured something like that might have happened, so we made some food that might help, the girl said, handing me a small box of scrambled eggs, as well as a small cup of what looked and smelled like miso soup. Raising an eyebrow again, I gave the girl an appreciative look. Oh, thanks. I began looking at her and the woman raised an eyebrow before giving a small start. Oh, I never introduced myself, did I? I'm Maki, she said, raising a hand out to shake mine. Setting down the containers next to the door, I awkwardly shook her hand. So, Naruto's okay. I honestly didn't mean for anything like this to happen, Kankuro said, and I gave him a long look before sighing, closing my eyes. He'll be fine. He just needs to get some rest. In fact, by the time he wakes up, he should be fine. He's just going through something that alcohol won't just fix, I said, and he nodded before looking at me in surprise. You know, you don't seem like how the legends describe you, he said, and certainly nothing like the tailed beast inside of Gar, he said. And I looked thoughtful for a few seconds before realizing who he was talking about. Are you seriously comparing me to the One-Tails? I am nothing like Shukaku. I am the queen of the Beges, I said, and he raised his hands up. Hey, I was just making an observation. Anyways, we should get going. We just wanted to see how Naruto was doing before we headed over to guard the village entrance, he said. And the girl named Maki spoke up. Please make sure to let him know we stopped by and that we hope he feels better, she said, and I nodded as they turned to leave. Closing the door, I picked up the food, bringing it into the bedroom. Who was at the door? A voice asked, and I looked up in surprise, only to see that Na was sitting up in bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Oh, it was as well as that Maki girl. They were wondering how you were doing and they brought you some food, I said, placing the food next to him on the bedside table. Looking at it in interest, he slowly sat up more. So, how are you feeling? You weren't doing so well this morning, I said. And he paused in his reaching for the miso soup for a few seconds. Well, my head feels a lot better and I don't feel like getting sick, he said, grabbing the dish of eggs before looking at me and holding it out. Want some? He asked, and I shook my head, shrugging. He took a bite. Basically, I'm feeling as good as new, he continued, and I nodded in slight relief. I'm glad. You really looked like, earlier, I said, and he looked at me in annoyance. Gee, thanks, he said before sighing. Though you aren't wrong, I certainly felt like that, he said, going silent as he continued to eat. Breaking the silence, I cleared my throat. So, have you decided where we're going to go and what we're going to do? I mean, after we visit these friends of yours near the hidden mist and you learn Sage Mode, what then? Do you have any plans? I asked, and he frowned, looking thoughtful for a few seconds. Honestly, I was just planning on us traveling around. Being part of a village meant we could never really do that, he said, and I nodded before frowning slightly. Okay, but what about after that? What about money? Rio is going to be a bit harder to come across, honestly, I said, and he again looked thoughtful before shrugging. We could always freelance. I'm sure we could find people who need jobs done for them, he said, and I nodded once again. I guess that could work, I said as he finished off his eggs, setting down the dish and sitting back with a contented sigh. Sitting in silence for a bit, we watched as the room gradually grew darker, the sun slowly sinking over the horizon. As the street lights kicked on, Na slowly stood up, looking at me. Well, I've been in bed for long enough. I could use some fresh air. Want to come? He asked, and I thought about telling him he should rest up a bit more before sighing. You know what? Sure, I said, and he smiled, grabbing his jumpsuit and putting it on before zipping it up and walking to the door. Following him, we made our way out of the apartment, heading into the village. Looking up at the sky, Na let out a sigh, and I looked at him in confusion. What is it? I asked, and he shook his head. Oh, it's nothing. I'm just a little excited about heading out again, he said. And I continued to look at him. You know, at first I was sad about having to leave the Hidden Leaf, but now I'm actually happy. Before the only way we were allowed to leave was if we had a mission, but now we can go anywhere, he said, and I gave him a weak smile. I guess that's true. It's just a shame it had to happen this way, I said, and he shrugged. It was bound to happen eventually, he said before continuing. I'm just glad I'm not alone, he said, and I blinked before giving him a smile. Right, so what did you want to do? I asked, and he once again shrugged, continuing to look at the stars. Honestly, I just felt like getting some fresh air after being inside all day, he said. And I looked up at the stars as well. After a few seconds, he looked at me. Hey Kurama, I have a question I've been meaning to ask you. Before you mentioned an old man's 6 paths, did you mean the sage of 6 paths? He asked, and I sighed in content at the fond memories I had of the man who had raised the other Beges and I one and the Sam. Though we were never so formal with him, I said, and Naruto looked surprised. I always thought he was just a legend. You actually knew him. What was he like? He asked, looking at me in interest. Shrugging, I continued to walk next to him, thinking about the old man who raised us. Well, I guess you could say he was a father figure to me and the others, I said, and Naruto looked at me in confusion. You see, at first, the others and I were once one being known only as the 10 Tails. He separated us into 9 different beings and raised us. He even gave us each names, I said, trailing off. Anyways, that's probably not what you wanted to know about, I said, and he shook his head, still looking interested. No, that's okay. Go on, he said. And I looked at him for a few seconds before continuing. He was a fair and trusting man. He believed that we would find someone who we could trust as much as him and who would show us what true power was. Seeing how humans were, I didn't really believe him. I said, and Naruto looked at me in confusion. But you trust me, right? He asked, and I looked at him with a deadpan look. What kind of question is that? Do you even have to ask? Of course, I trust you, I said before blinking. In fact, for some reason, you remind me a lot of the old man, I said. And he blinked, looking surprised. Ah, really? He asked, and I nodded. Yeah, maybe there's some relation, I said, before sighing. Whatever happened to him, if you don't mind me asking, he asked, and I shook my head. Splitting us up into 9 beings certainly didn't help. It weakened him greatly and forced him into an extended bed rest. However, it was old age that eventually got him. We didn't call him Old Man 6 Paths for nothing, I said, and he nodded in understanding. Anyways, maybe I'll tell you more about him later, I said, and he once again nodded. After walking around for a bit longer, my stomach began to growl and Naruto looked up at me in confusion. I thought you weren't hungry. Why didn't you want any of the food from before? He asked, and I frowned. I never once said I wasn't hungry. I just wasn't going to eat the food that was made to help you feel better, I said, and he rolled his eyes slightly. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded, but if you want, we could always stop and get some tofu, he said, and I perked up slightly before remembering that we needed to save Rio if we wanted to get anywhere. Wait, how much Rio do you have? Remember, it has to last until we can find work, I said, and he nodded. I know, and don't worry, we have plenty left. Remember, I had to live by myself. So, I got accustomed to saving, and as a result, I've saved a lot. Now, do you want to or not? He said, and I bit my lip before nodding. Then come on, he said, and we began making our way to the shop from before. Making it to the little shop, we opened the door and walked inside. The woman behind the counter looked up. Welcome, she said before recognizing us from before. Oh, hello again. What can I get you too? She asked, and Na stepped forward. Hello, can we get 3 things of tofu? He asked, and the woman nodded. Certainly, she said, grabbing 3 blocks of tofu, putting them in a bag and sliding them to him as she took the money. You must really like tofu, she commented, and Na shrugged. Honestly, I'm not much of a tofu eater, but Kurama loves it, he said, passing the bag to me. The woman nodded, smiling as I immediately opened the wrapping on one and began to eat. Well, that's okay. I'm happy someone likes it, she said. And I gave an affirmative nod. Well, we should get going. Hope you have a good night, Naruto said, and the woman nodded and smiled. Okay, and thanks you, too, she said as we began to leave the shop. Finishing the first block of tofu, I turned to Na. So, what do you want to do now? It's getting late. We could head back to the apartment, I said, looking up, seeing that the moon was fully in view. He shrugged, letting out a sigh. We could, but I'm not really tired, are you? He asked, and I frowned, shaking my head, sighing again. He looked thoughtful. Well, since you're feeling better, We could always go to the cave and train, I said, and he immediately seemed to perk up slightly. Really? He asked, and I nodded. I don't see a reason not to. You rested, and you're feeling better. If you wanted to get some more training in on the Rasengan, we can, I said, and he immediately nodded. That would be awesome, he said, and I couldn't help but to chuckle at his enthusiasm. Well, then, let's get to the cave, I said before leading the way towards the entrance. Waving to Kangaroo to let him know we were going through, we made our way out of the village into the cave. Entering the training area and lighting the torches, Naruto began his training, summoning a few clones before beginning to work on his Rinnegan. After about an hour, he disbanded his clones before leaning against the wall, looking worn out. I think I've got it down, he said, and I blinked. Having been watching him, I couldn't help but be surprised by how fast he had learned to successfully form and maintain the Rinnegan. Well, color me impressed. Your father would have been impressed by how fast you were able to master his jutsu, I said, and he smiled, looking proud of himself. In fact, since you've successfully mastered the one-handed Rasen, I think you're ready to learn the BJU bomb, I said, and he looked at me in excitement, forgetting all about his weariness. Really? Can I learn it now? He asked, and I frowned slightly. Not at this very moment. No, this will take quite a bit of energy to use, I said before sighing as I saw his disheartened look, though I suppose it wouldn't who. RT to show you a demonstration. Quote, I said, beginning to gather energy into the palm of my hand as he watched in interest. As if forming a Rinnegan, I focused on forming the energy into a sphere. However, instead of using just normal chakra, I began to inject some of my own. And after a few seconds, the sphere in my hands began to gain a dark purple hue. And after a few more seconds, I had a successful Beiju bomb formed. Taking aim at one of the wooden training dummies, I chucked the ball of energy at it, destroying the dummy on contact, causing splinters to go flying. Whoa, Naruto said, and I smirked, wiping the sweat from my forehead and taking a deep breath. That was the Beiju bomb, I said. And he looked at me in shock. That's what you plan on teaching me? He asked incredulously, and I once again smirked. Yep, and you wondered whether or not I trusted you, I said teasingly, and he looked away. Now, come on, let's get back to the apartment and get some sleep so you can have the energy you need to perform the BJU bomb, I said, and he frowned. I'm not even tired, though, he said, and I raised an eyebrow. Oh, well, I certainly know a way we can tire each other out, I said, smirking and pressing against him. And he looked at me in confusion. How? He asked before he seemingly caught on, rolling his eyes. Seriously? He asked, and I looked at him in confusion. Is the only thing you think about? He asked, and I pouted. No, of course not. I also think about food, I said, sticking my tongue out playfully, causing him to roll his eyes once again. Either way, you didn't say no, I said, and he smiled slightly. I haven't said yes either, he said as we made our way back to the apartment. We'll just have to see when we get there, won't we? He asked, and I continued smirking, licking my lips in anticipation for the fun night I was positive was in S. Tor. Okay, now start mixing in my chakra, Kurama said, watching from a slight distance as I trained on using the Beiju bomb. We had arrived at the training cave early in the morning, and Kurama got to training me right away. After about an hour, I had begun to show progress, able to create a small version of what she had. Albeit weak, she had looked impressed. Doing what she instructed, I began pumping in some of her chakra, mixing hers in with the Rinnegan. For the first few seconds, everything was going well, and the orb of pure energy began to grow in size before a searing pain shot up my palms. Flinching, I shook my hands out of reflex, sending the build-up energy to go flying towards the ground and causing a small explosion in front of me, which cow said me to go flying backwards. Nah, she called, and I just groaned, wiping my face with my hands, only to WSE as more pain shot through my palms. Seeing that I was hurt, Kurama ran over to me. What happened? I asked, and she carefully helped me up, examining my palms. After a few seconds, she sighed. Chakra burns. You've managed to burn your hands. Luckily, it doesn't look too bad, she said. And I looked at her in concern. Seeing this, she gave me a calming look. Relax. Like I said, it doesn't look that bad. You still should be able to use jutsu in small amounts, she said. And I frowned. What happened? I repeated. Everything looked like it was going well, I said, and she once again sighed. You build up my chakra too fast. You have to build it up steadily. If you don't, it becomes unstable and it becomes more likely to cause more harm than good, as seen by your hands, she said, and I nodded in understanding. Okay, got it. Let me try again, I said, and she just shook her head. I'm afraid not, she said before continuing when I was about to protest. Look at your hands. They may not that badly burned, but do you really want to make them worse? Because that's exactly what is going to happen if you continue right now. Just slow down and let your hands heal. All right, she asked and I sighed, nodding, and she gave me a small smile. Good. Now that that is out of the way, I'm really impressed with how quickly you were able to start making dew bombs, even if they were small, she said. And I shrugged before grinning. Honestly, I don't get why you were saying it was so difficult. I seem to get the hang of it faster than I did the Rasengan, I said. And she blinked before her gaze hardened and she frowned. Are you saying, she said before taking a deep breath. You know what? I'm going to ignore the fact you think the most ultimate move a Genchiri can learn is easy. No, the truth is it should have taken you a week, if not two, to get even as far as you did today. However, you seem to have an affinity to my chakra, she said. And I looked at her in surprise. Really? I asked and she nodded, looking at me in interest. Yes, though I don't sense any reason you should. You may have gotten it from the many times I attempted to take over. I mean, I had to use your body, so I had to access my chakra through you. Then again, it could have come from when that old bastard tried to quicken your training by loosening the seal. She said, and I froze, looking at her in confusion. Wait, what? I asked and she looked at me for a few seconds before a look of realization crossed her face. Oh. Right, you most likely don't remember any of that. She said before going on, Jiraiya decided to try and speed up your training by loosening the seal. He thought that you could be stronger if you were able to hold me back and control me. Needless to say, it didn't work. And I showed him how much he up. I nearly killed him. He's lucky I wasn't even at my full strength. She said, and I looked at her uncomfortably seeing this, she sighed. What? Don't tell me you still care what happens to that old man. She said, and I frowned. Well, sort of. I mean, he taught me a lot of what I know, including the Rasengan. For a while, he was a father figure to me. He may have exiled me, but I don't think I could ever truly hate someone. I said, and she looked at me for a few seconds before nodding in understanding. So, you were loose. Why didn't you go on a rampage like before? I asked and she looked away. Well, like I said before, I wasn't at full strength at the time. When I took over that day, I was only able to get up to the equivalent of the Forel's power. At that point, the old man slapped a temporary seal on me and I lost the reins. She said and I nodded in understanding before something caught my attention. Wait, are you saying they had a way to reseal you? I thought they said that I had to leave because you couldn't be resealed. I said and she sighed. Well, yes and no. She said before continuing when she saw my confusion. They could have sealed me again, but only for a few seconds. Since the main seal was undone, it would only be a temporary fix. Why the sudden interest? She asked and I shook my head. No reason. I was just starting to think that they were just looking for any reason to get me out of the village. I said and she frowned, looking away. After a few seconds, she looked back. So, what do you want to do now? We can't continue training today. So, what do you want to do for the rest of the day? She asked and I shrugged. Well, we could go get something to eat. I mean, there's nothing much I have in mind to do, and we leave tomorrow, so maybe we could take this time to get mething good to eat, I said. And she perked up slightly. You mean like tofu? She asked in excitement, and I sighed and rolled my eyes. No, Kurama, I don't mean tofu. I was thinking of something more filling. In fact, I saw a place like the yakiniku here. So, what about it? Would you be willing to go there? I asked and she smiled slightly, nodding. Sure. after we stop by the medical office and get your hands looked at and bandaged up. After all, I'm unable to heal you like I used to, she said. And I began to say something only to be cut off. And don't try to say you'll be okay. You may not want to admit it, but I can tell your hands are hurting, she said. And I sighed. All right, well, if I can't do any more training today, we might as well start heading into the village now, I said, and she nodded before extinguishing the torches. As we left the cave, I decided to at least try and make some small talk. So, we'll be going to this land of tofu soon. What is it like, and how has nobody ever found it? I asked, and she looked thoughtful. Well, the island is protected by a jutsu. Whenever a human gets too close, a storm will begin to form and a thick fog covers the sea. Whoever got too close would be forced to turn around and head for safety, she said. And I looked at her in surprise. As for what it's like, you'll just have to find out when we get there, she said, sticking out her tongue. Wait, how are we supposed to get there? If we can't get close without it getting stormy and foggy, how are we supposed to get there by boat? I asked and she blinked. Who said anything about boats? No, that's another use for the fox summons. In order for us to get to the land of tofu, you'd need to get Tatsu to reverse summon us there. So, whenever you're ready, all you have to do is call forth Tatsu, she said, and I nodded in understanding before falling silent again. Eventually, making it to the village, we made our way to the medical building. Walking inside, we were approached by a medical ninja. Hello, can I help you with anything? The woman asked, and Kurama in her human disguise more and stepped forward. Yes, we were training and Naruto here got some chakra burns on his hands. Is there any way you can look at his hands? She asked, and the woman nodded. Certainly, she said before holding out her hands expectantly. Hesitantly placing my hands against hers, the medical ninja began examining my palms. After a few seconds, she nodded to herself. It doesn't really look too bad here. I'd say just to put some salve on your hands, then wrapping them with bandages, she said, going into one of the rooms before returning with a small dish of a green-colored salve and some cloth, rubbing the medicine into my palms as instructed. I once again held my hands out, and the woman wrapped them up. There we go. That should do. Try not to use any heavy chakra using jutsu for at least 3 days to give your hands time to heal, she said. And I gave her a thankful look. Thank you, and I'm sorry you had to use your supplies on a non-shinobi, especially on something as small as this, I said, and she shook her head. Don't. There's no reason to apologize. While we don't go out of our way to help every non-san shinobi, we would not turn them away if they needed help and didn't mean any harm. We especially wouldn't turn away a friend of Lord Gar, she said before giving me a smile. Now that you've been treated, you're free to go. We have a few patients we still have to look after, she said. And I nodded, thanking her once again before turning around and walking out of the building. Kurama right behind me. Great. Now I feel like bushy brows, I said, looking down at my arms. And Kurama just looked at me in confusion. Bushy brows. Who's that? She asked, and I sighed, continuing to look at my arms before looking back up at her. His real name is Rock Lee. He knows no Enjutsu or Genjutsu, but he makes up for that with his exceptional Taijutsu. Because of all his practicing, his arms and hands are covered completely in bandages. I explained and she nodded. He sounds like an interesting person. No Enjutsu or Genjutsu. How did he even become a ninja in the first place? She asked, and I smiled. Like I said before, he more than makes up for it with his taijutsu, I said, and she looked at me for a few seconds. You seem to be speaking quite fondly of him. Was he one of your previous friends? She asked, and I nodded. Yeah, though, Lee was a bit different from the others. He seemed to only miss my birthdays because he is on missions. In fact, he was out of the village when I was exiled, I said, and she nodded. Falling silent, we made our way down the street and towards the restaurant I saw before. Walking inside, I waved to the woman at the front counter and she smiled, making a note in a notebook in front of her. Taking our seat, Kurama looked at me in confusion. So, what is there to eat here? She asked, and I realized that this may be her first time eating somewhere like this. Well, they sell all kinds of meat here, from pork to beef, and even short ribs, I said, and she nodded, looking interested. What are you getting? She asked, and I smiled. Oh, I plan on getting the short ribs. What about you? Do you have an idea of what you'd want to get? I asked, and she nodded. I might try what you're getting, she said, and I gave her a smile. Okay, how about we just get one big dish of short ribs, and if you like them, we can get more, I suggested, and she agreed. A few minutes later, a waiter walked over to our table, a notebook in his hands. Welcome. What can I get you today? He asked, and I gave him a smile. Hello. Can I get a large dish of short ribs, please? I asked, and he wrote it down in his small notebook. Certainly, he said before turning to Kurama. And what about you, miss? Would you like anything? He asked, and she blinked before shaking her head. We're sharing for right now, she said. And the waiter nodded before putting away his notebook. Right, well, I'll be back in a bit with your food, he said before turning and making his way towards a room to the left. Left to ourselves, everything was quiet for a few seconds before Kurama flashed me an uncomfortable look. I am not used to people being this comfortable around me. I must say I don't really like it, she said, and I looked at her in surprise and confusion. What do you mean? I asked, and she sighed. I mean, I'm the Ninetales, the queen of the Beges. I'm supposed to be feared, and nobody here even realizes it. They have no idea how close they are to their possible end, she said, and I nodded, though I still didn't get what the problem was. Okay, but I have to ask, why is it so important to be feared? I asked, and she looked at me incredulously for a few seconds. Aren't you even listening? I am so much stronger than them. I could end them in a second. I should be feared, she said. And seeing that I was still not getting it, she sighed. Look, there's just something satisfying about being feared. Being feared means that people understand that you are stronger, that they understand their place, she said. And I blinked, remembering growing up being feared. Being feared all the time. You know that I know what that's like. How could you willingly choose to live like that? I asked, and she gave me a deadpan look. Are you forgetting who you're talking about? She asked before rolling her eyes. You may not like the feeling, but I reveled in it. Having everyone act as if I was normal. It's as if they're mocking who I am, she said. And I sighed. Well, if it means anything, I may not fear you, but I know who you really are, I said, and she looked at me for a few long seconds before sighing, calming down. HMP, she said. Though she grinned, continuing to talk for a bit, the waiter eventually returned, carrying a plate of short ribs. Setting them down in front of us, he gave us a smile. Here you go. If you need anything else, just call. Okay, he said, and I nodded, thanking him. As he walked away, I picked up my chopsticks. Kurama doing the same quickly, showing her how to prepare the meat. We began to eat. After taking a bite, Kurama immediately began scarfing down the ribs, almost being able to put Choji to shame. Not wanting to be left with nothing, I quickly began to eat as well. After ordering a few more plates and leaving the money on the table, we had left the restaurant, heading back to the apartment with full stomachs. Reaching the apartment, Kurama laid back in bed, rubbing her stomach and sighing in content, releasing her disguise. Okay, that was pretty good, she said, and I chuckled. Oh, yeah, whatever happened to you not wanting our human slop? I asked, quoting what she had said on the day she had escaped the seal. Well, I guess some of your human slop is good, she said, giving a grin. After a few seconds of laying in bed, she sat back up. So, what do you want to do now? She asked, looking at me questioningly. Looking out the window, I could see that it was just past midday and the sun was making its slow crawl down the sky. It may still be pretty early, but let's get some sleep. Tomorrow is the day we head out, I said, taking off my overshirt, leaving me in a shirt as I hopped into bed. Biting her lip, she inched closer before wrapping her arms around me and leaning close to my ear. Are you sure you want to just sleep? She asked, rubbing her body against mine. Because we can do so much more if you want, she said, her words barely a whisper, causing me to shiver. Looking at her for a few seconds, I couldn't help but to shake my head, much to her apparent disappointment. You really are insatiable, aren't you? I swear, is the only thing you ever truly think about, I said, and she gave me a lecherous grin. That may be, But you know you love me, she said before leaning forward and tilting her head, capturing my lips with hers. After a minute or two, we separated and I looked her in the eyes, panting slightly. So, you're not going to be satisfied until I pleasure you, are you? I asked, and she chuckled, licking her lips. That's right, she said, before slipping out of her clothes. Once she got out of her panties, she turned back towards me. So, why don't you just take those pants off and let me do? Not this time, I said, cutting her off and pushing her onto her back, much to her shock and confusion. Goo, she puffed as her back hit the mattress, and she was stunned for a few seconds. Nah W, she tried to say, only to cut herself off with a gasp as I managed to pry open her legs, causing her cheeks to turn a deeper shade of red. Nah, she repeated. And I smirked, pulling her closer to me, her tail softly beating against me in weak, mock defense. You know, I'm getting really tired of you always deciding that you're in control. I think it's time we switched roles for a bit, I said, slowly circling her nether lips with my finge. To tease her, careful not to touch them. She wed a bit, causing me to chuckle. I'm in control this time. Got it? I asked, getting closer and closer with my finger, only to move it away, right before it could touch. For the first few minutes, she tried to keep strong to stay the one in control. However, after a bit more teasing, she finally caved. All right, why you win. You can be in control. Jay, just stop teasing me and get on with whatever it is you plan on doing. She demanded, and I looked at her for a few seconds, contemplating continuing to tease her for that order before deciding that enough was enough. Slowing down my circling, I pulled my hand away. Looking at me in desperation and disbelief, she gave another whine. However, before she could say anything, I looked into her eyes and grinned before taking a deep breath and plunging my face into her moist slit, sending my tongue to rub against her walls. Eyes widening in surprise and relief, she threw her head back and let out a loud moan of pleasure. Having never done anything like this before, I had no idea whether or not I was doing this right. Though her loud moans of pleasure made me think I was doing good enough. After a little bit longer, I had to pull back and catch my breath. Gasping for air, I looked to Kurama. Her face was beet red, her tongue sticking out slightly, and her eyes shut tight. Smirking, I opened my mouth to talk, only for her to press her hands against the back of my head and press me back down. Hey, I'm supposed to be in control, I said, only for my voice to be muffled in her depths, causing her to moan and press on me harder. Why, yes, just like that, she yelled, grinding against my face, figuring that I wouldn't be going anywhere until I got her off. I once again dug in, sending my tongu deep inside. After a few minutes, Kurama giving me small chances to breathe, I could tell she was getting closer. Her walls spastically gripped and released my tongue, as if trying to milk it for something it couldn't give. Besides the rhythmic grip and release of my tongue, her hands also pushed me deeper and harder against her. Feeling the need to breathe once again, I tried to pull away only to realize that I couldn't move an inch. Beginning to struggle, I tried to pull away to get more air, but the more I struggled, the more she pressed down. As a last-ditch effort, I grabbed her clip between my thumb and index finger and squeezed, causing her to gasp. The mix of pleasure and pleasure, sending her over the edge. With a long moan, her juices flowed, getting in my mouth as well as all over my face. Finally coming down from her high, she seemed to realize what happened. Feeling my weakening struggles, she immediately let go. Nah, she said, pulling me up into a sitting position. Are you okay? She asked, and after a few seconds, I began to cough and gasp for air. Catching my breath, I gave her a look. I thought I was in control, I said, and she slowly shook her head. Oh. Nah, I thought you would have realized. You have to be the strongest one to be in control. You may be getting there, but you're not there yet, she said, and I felt a blow to my pride. Seeing this, she frowned for a few seconds before giving a lusty smile. It was a great attempt. Though it seems you were so busy attempting to dominate me, you didn't get any pleasure back. Quote. She said, reaching into my pants and boxes, grabbing my which has been trying to escape its clothing prison this whole time. So I repeat, why don't you slip out of those clothing and let me give you some pleasure? She said, her voice is smooth as silk. Swallowing, I followed her suggestion, removing my pants and boxes as well as my t-shirt. As my popped out, she grinned, licking her lips. "Oh, I've got something special in mind for you," she said. And I looked at her in confusion. "Something special?" I asked, and she nodded. "Yep," she said, placing her hands below her and giving them a bounce before pressing them together. "Why don't you come over here and stick your between here?" she said, sticking out her tongue and licking the crevice between her. "Why you're?" I asked, and she gave me a deadpan look. "Yes, my don't play dumb. I've seen the way you look at 'em," she said. And I looked away slightly before moving over to her. "So, what do I have to do?" I asked, and she once again smiled lustfully. "Just stay there and let me work my magic," she said with a chuckle before leaning forward and wrapping me in the soft warmth of her. As she slowly began to move up and down, I groaned, losing myself in the snug warmth. Looking up at me and giving me a wink, she slowly lifted her head until it was right above it, then gently lowered her head, engulfing my member in her mouth, gently sucking on the tip. Carefully taking in more, she began to rhythmically bob her head, turning her head slightly every few seconds. After a couple minutes, I really began to enjoy myself. And after a few more minutes, my hands found their way to the back of her head behind her ears. The moment my hands touched the back of her head, she hummed in surprise, which caused a jolt of pleasure to run up my spine. After a split-second pause, she closed her eyes, seemingly accepting the placement of my hands as I slowly began moving her head. Chuckling and sending more vibrations through she began to move with the motions of my hands. And soon, I was careening closer and closer to my release. Taking to heart what she had said before about needing to be stronger to be in control and realizing that this might be my last chance. Feeling myself about to blow, I began to pull back, much to her confusion. Lifting her mouth off of me, she looked at me in confusion. "What are you?" she began before being cut off by a groan from me. Sensing what was about to happen, she quickly closed her eyes right as I let out another groan and went over the edge. The first shot hit and landed across her tightly closed left eye and her cheek. The second shot hit her bottom lip and her chin as she flinched backwards, pulling back and releasing from her. Finally, the last shot landed across her exposed. Finally coming down, I was able to catch my breath. Looking up at Kurama, I could see her glaring at me. Though the way she looked right now, it was hard to take her seriously. "Really?" she asked, giving a small huff of annoyance. "Here, let me go get you a paper towel or something," I said, snickering slightly. Seeing my snickering, her glare turned to a grin. "Oh, no need. I have something right here," she said before grabbing my discarded t-shirt. "Wait, what?" I asked before I noticed my shirt. "Wait, not my shirt," I said before she wiped her face and with it. "Great, now I've got to throw my t-shirt in the washer," I said. "Well, you should have thought of that before you did what you did," she said before sticking out her tongue and throwing the shirt at me. Sighing, I took it to the washer before tossing it in. Starting it up, I returned to the bed. "Such a waste, too," she said, taking her finger and wiping off some of the cum she had missed before sticking that finger into her mouth and licking it off. Not being able to look away, I began to feel myself getting hard again. Seeing this, she chuckled. "Nah, I'm not feeling in the mood right now," she said. And I looked at her in surprise. "You not in the mood? That's a first," I said before continuing. "But come on, you can't be that upset, can you?" I asked and she shook her head. "Oh, I'm not upset. I'm just showing you that just because we're mates, that doesn't mean you can get away with everything," she said, and I sighed, hopping into bed. "If I really was upset, we wouldn't be sleeping in the same bed," she said. And I nodded in understanding. "Now, come on, you were right, let's get some sleep," she said before laying down and turning around her back towards me. Though she said she wasn't upset, I could still tell she was. Laying down next to her, I sighed once again. "Sorry," I said, and when I got no reply other than a slight flick of a tail, I nodded to myself before closing my eyes and preparing to sleep. Rolling over in bed, I slowly opened my eyes, noticing that Kurama wasn't next to me. Stretching and sitting up, I looked around, finally noticing her looking out the window. One of her ears giving a twitch, she looked over at me. "So, You're finally awake, she said, an edge to her voice. Blinking. I looked at her in confusion for a few seconds, my tired mind trying to think of why she would be upset before I remembered last night. You still mad about last night? I asked, and she once again looked out the window. Didn't I tell you before that I wasn't mad? She asked, and I frowned. You say that, but I said, trailing off, giving up with whatever she was looking at outside. She turned back towards me, looking at me with curiosity. What even compelled you to do that? She asked, and I flinched slightly before sighing. I don't know. I guess I just wanted a last chance to feel like I was in control, I said, and she looked at me for a few seconds before rolling her eyes. Are you serious? How about the next time you get an idea like that, you think it through, then choose not to do it? She said before sighing. Though if it means that much to you to be in control, I suppose I could try to let you once in a while. But after you master sage mode, she said, seeing the look on my face, nodding understandingly, I began to get out of bed. Watching me, Kurama closed the curtain and stood up. So, what's the plan? Today's the day we head out again, right? She asked, and I nodded. Yeah. What time is it, by the way? I asked, and she looked at the clock on the wall. About 9:30, she said, and I once again nodded, thinking for a minute or two. Okay, we still have some time. After I get dressed and throw my shirt into the dryer, do you want to go get something to eat? I asked, managing to get a smile and a nod. Getting up, I walked over to the washer, opening it and grabbing my soaked shirt, transferring it to the dryer and turning it on. I closed the hatch before making my way over to my suitcase to grab a new shirt. Getting dressed, I turned to Kurama. Are you ready? I asked, and she nodded, slipping on her shirt before following me as I opened the door. Locking the door behind us, we walked around the village for a bit, looking for a good place to get something to eat. Deciding to get some dumplings, we ended up stopping at a small tea shop in the village. Ordering some sweet dumplings, we sat down at a table with our dumplings. Picking one of the skewers up, Kurama took a bite, closing her eyes in contentment before opening her eyes again and looking at me in curiosity. So, we're moving on to the land of waves next, right? She asked, and I looked at her for a few seconds before shaking my head. Actually, I wanted to make 2 quick stops first, I said, and she looked at me in confusion. By the way, are you able to change disguises, or is that the only one you know? I asked, and she smirked. Why? What's wrong with this disguise? Getting tired of my looks already? She asked playfully, sticking her tongue out, and I shook my head. Like I said, I wanted to make a couple stops, I said, and her playful smirk faded, being replaced by a serious look. You want to stop by the hidden leaf, don't you? She asked, and I hesitated for a few seconds before nodding, causing her to frown. Are you sure that's a good idea? They're going to be on the lookout for you and me now, and you plan on waltzing in? She asked, and I sighed. I want to get one last look at the village, and of course, I'm not going to just walk in. I'll be disguised as well. Plus, this would give us a chance to get some Ikyaku ramen. I can promise you that you'd enjoy it, I said, and she continued to frown before sighing again. It's up to you. Just be careful. We aren't really on good terms with the village, she said before continuing. Anyways, yes, I do know some other forms, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm curious though what you have in mind as a disguise, she said, and I smiled, picking up a skewer and beginning to eat. After finishing up and paying, we left and I took a breath of fresh air. Well, I'd say we should head back and pack up, then stop by and say goodbye to Gar as well as thank him for everything, I said, and Kurama nodded before looking thoughtful. You know, I still find it surprising how helpful he's been, especially with who's inside him, she said, and I frowned. True, though Gar is a good friend. From what I've seen, he's nothing like Shukaku anymore, I said quietly, and she looked at me in surprise for a few seconds. I almost forgot you faced Shukaku during those Chunin exams. I'm just shocked you were able to defeat him as you were back then, without my help even, she said as we walked. And I blinked. Well, that's not true. I did have your help in a way, I said, and she looked at me in confusion. In the end, I had to help Gamaba by picturing you so that he could use genjutsu, I said, and she frowned. I must not have been paying attention then. Still, to defeat Shukaku without using my chakra, that's impressive. She said, and I smiled. After a few seconds of silence, she spoke up again. So, you said there was 2 stops you wanted to make. Besides the Leaf Village, where else did you want to stop? She asked. Gar told me about this person near the land of waves that makes weapons for Genturi. I may no longer be a Genturi, but I still have access to your chakra, and these weapons utilize that chakra. I said, and her eyes narrowed. Really? How come I've never heard of this person? She asked, and I shrugged. I don't know, but Gar gave me an address. I have it written down at the apartment, I said, and she nodded thoughtfully. After walking for about 5 minutes, we made it back to the apartment. Leaving the door open, I pulled my suitcase backpack out from under the bed and began to pack away Kurama and I's things. Getting my shirt from the dryer, I put it in the backpack before slinging it around my back. Seeing the slip of paper with the address on it, I handed it to Kurama. Taking it and looking it over, she frowned. Like I said before, I've never heard of any weaponsmiths who could forge weapons that utilize a Genshi's chakra like that. Though I have been locked away for quite a while, so it could be real, though I would be wary of it being a possible trap, she said. And I looked at her in shock. You're not seriously thinking that Gar would send us into a trap, are you? I asked, and she shook her head. No, of course not. I'm just saying there are people out there that wouldn't think twice about going after a Genturi. If it is a trap, it could have very well been originally meant for Gar, she said before sighing. Just be cautious around things that may be too good to be true. Okay, she prompted and I nodded, giving her a calming smile. Don't worry, we'll be fine. This could even be a good chance to get better weapons, I said, and she just nodded slightly. Still not seeming all that sure. I'll tell you what, let's at least scope it out. If it seems like a trap, well go right on by. Okay, I asked, and she sighed and shrugged. It's mainly up to you, she said, and I straightened the bag strap. Right, well, let's start heading for Gar's office. I said, double checking that I had everything before stepping out of the apartment and closing the door after Kurama, locking it for the last time. Heading down and handing the key to the man behind the desk, we began heading for the K's Cage building. NG. Having already paid for the apartment we were staying in. Making our way to the K Cage building's front door, we stepped inside immediately being greeted by Tamari, who was standing near the hallway that led to Gar's office. Oh. Good morning Naruto Kurama. How are you? She asked and I smiled. Good morning, Tamari. We're doing okay. What about you? I asked and she shrugged. Well, I certainly can't complain. So, what are you here for this morning? She asked and I sighed. We're getting ready to head out. We just wanted to stop by and thank you all for everything. I said, and her eyes widened slightly. Really? You're leaving already? She asked and I nodded. I'm afraid so. We were only staying for a week. We have things figured out and we're ready to start now. I said and she nodded understandingly, though she still looked slightly sad. I get it. So, I take it you'd like to see Gar now? She asked and I nodded. Okay, well, follow me. He's talking with Kankuro right now, so this actually works out. She said, leading us to the door to Gar's office before knocking and opening the door slightly, peeking her head inside. Excuse me, Garanko, Naruto, and Kurama are here, she said. And Gar called for us to enter. Opening the door farther for us, Tamari let us enter before walking in and closing the door behind us. Ah. Good morning you two. Gar said and Kankuro nodded at us. Good morning. Sorry to bother you two, but we just wanted to thank you for everything as well as say that we're about to head out. I said, and he nodded understandingly. So, I take it you've planned out what you're going to do next? He asked and I nodded. Yeah, we're going to stop by and say goodbye to some friends in the land of waves as well as do some training. I said, and Gar gave me a knowing look. You've certainly been doing a lot of training lately. Kanguro was just telling me about the state of the training dummies in the training cave. He said, and I gave an apologetic look. Yeah, sorry about that. I was learning a new jutsu. I said, and Kanguro shook his head. Don't worry about it, they're pretty easy to make. I could make more though. I'm curious what kind of jutsu could do that much damage, he said. And I looked at Kurama, not sure if I should say anything about any jutsu she teaches me. After a few seconds, she shrugged. The Buju bomb, she said simply, and both Kangaroo and Gar looked at her in confusion. Is that the jutsu you said was volatile? Tamari spoke up, standing near the door. Kurama nodded before continuing. The BJU bomb is the highest level jutsu a Genchiri can learn and can only truly be taught by a tailed beast. She said, and Gar nodded in interest. I see. But then how was Naruto able to learn it? He's technically not a Genchiri anymore, he said. And Kurama nodded in acknowledgement. You're right, though he still has quite a bit of my chakra inside of him, which allows him to use the Buju bomb as if he was Sti. LL a Genchiri, she explained. So judging by the damage, I take it you've mastered this jutsu? Kangaroo asked, and I hesitated. Almost. So far, I'm only able to form small versions of it, I said. And he looked at me in shock. So, you're saying that that damage was caused by a jutsu that wasn't even at full power? He asked. Well, like I said, it is the highest level jutsu a Genchiri can learn. Kurama said, and shook his head in disbelief. After a few seconds of silence, I sighed. Well, it's about time we got ready to head out, I said, and Gar nodded understandingly. I understand. By the way, I meant to give this to you before, but I heard you were under the weather, he said before reaching into his desk. Looking at him in confusion, I watched as he pulled out an envelope and held it out for me. What's this? I asked, taking the envelope and looking at it curiously. This is your pay for helping guard the village. You may not be a member of the Hidden Sand, but that doesn't mean you don't get paid for helping out, he said. And I looked at him in surprise before opening the envelope. Looking inside and counting the Rio, my surprise turned into shock. This is 300 Rio. Are you sure about this? I asked, and he nodded. Yes. Like I told you before, guarding the village is usually reserved for the Andu and other Sand shinobi, so the pay is higher, he said, and I quickly thanked him. Shaking his head, he gave me a smile. Don't mention it. You did the work. You deserve to be paid for said work, he said before glancing out the window and sighing. Well, if you're going to be heading out, you should head out now before it's too late. It looks like we may get a sandstorm soon, he said. And I looked out only to see some clouds on the horizon. And I recalled the light breeze that seemed to pick up on the way here. Nodding, I started to make my way towards the door. Kurama following me before Gar spoke up. And Naruto, make sure to stop by sometime. Know that you're always welcome, he said, and Tamari nodded, smiling. I nodded, though I looked away. Thank you, and well try, but it might not be for a while. Kurama and I are going to be dropping off the grid for a while, I said, and Gar nodded understandingly, sighing to myself. We once again began making our way to the door. Thanks again for everything, Gar, Kankuro, Tamari, I said before opening the door. Oh, and Gar, I'm sure they'll come around eventually, I said, referring to the villagers. Before exiting the office, Kurama, following close behind, making our way to the entrance of the village, we began our trek to the first stop on our journey, the Hidden Leaf Village. Walking slowly through the desert, we plotted on heading towards the Land of Fire and in turn the Hidden Leaf Village. Passing by the dunes that signaled the view range from the village hidden in the sand, I turned to Kurama. You can drop the disguise now. We're out of eyesight, I said, and she frowned, looking at me in confusion. Huh? She asked before a look of realization crossed her face. Oh, she said before putting up the hand sign to release the disguise jutsu. Once back in her original form, she sighed in relief, rolling her shoulders and flexing her tails. I've gotten so used to being disguised, I almost forgot I still was, she said, and I nodded understandingly before she sighed and looked at me. So, what's the plan? Surely we couldn't just walk into the Hidden Leaf, even disguised. Wouldn't they still notice two strangers waltzing through the front gate? She asked, and I gave her a calming smile. The Hidden Leaf's security isn't that great if you know your way through it, I said, and she looked at me in interest. Oh, and I suppose you do. So, what's your big plan? She asked, and I smirked. Simple. The same way Itachi did. Being a previous Leaf Shinobi, we'll be able to enter the Hidden Leaf's territory without setting off the barrier jutsu. Once inside the territory, we'd make our way to the front gate where the guards are stationed. Since no alarms would have gone off, they'll assume we've been cleared for entry. Sure, they might ask us a few questions. Who are we? What are we doing there? And they might just pull out the bingo books, but we won't be in them. At least not our disguised selves. Once we're given entry to the village, we're good to go, I said, and Kurama looked at me in surprise. Hey, that's not actually that bad. You do have a plan, she said before giving me a suspicious look. Wait a minute, that's the kind of plan that takes quite a bit of thinking. How long have you been planning to return to the village? She asked, and I shrugged. Since before I even brought it up, I said, and she sighed. But that doesn't matter right now. The point is, we have a plan to get in, I said, and she nodded. So, Naruto, I know you said you just wanted to take a look around, but why else do you want to go to the hidden leaf so bad? She asked, and I sighed. I may have had a hard time growing up in that village, but the fact is I still grew up there. They may have hated me, but it was still my home. If we're going to be dropping off the map for a while, I at least want to spend one last day in the village without worrying about any hate, I said, and her gaze seemed to soften. Right, I have another question, she said, and I looked at her for a few seconds before shaking my head slightly. Wait, what's with the sudden 20 questions? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Kurama just shrugged her shoulders. Just generally curious and trying to pass the time while we walk. That's all, she said before going on. Anyways, if you were given the chance to have lived your life without me sealed inside of you, would you take that chance? She asked, looking genuinely curious. Looking at her in surprise for a few seconds, I once again looked ahead of us before frowning. You know, earlier in life, the answer would probably have been yes. Things definitely would have been easier growing up, but nowadays I've realized something when looking back, I said, and she looked at me curiously. Looking back, having you sealed inside me did more good than bad. It gave me something to overcome. You, albeit unintentionally, made me stronger the more you tried to break the seal. So, looking back, no, I would not take the chance. Was that the answer you were looking for? I asked and she smiled, wrapping a tail around me. After walking for a few hours, the wind began to pick up and clouds of sand began to fly by us. Covering her muzzle with her shirt, she looked up and shielded her eyes. It looks like that sandstorm that Gar mentioned before is beginning to hit, she said. And I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt as well. Looking up ahead, I could just barely see the cave from before up ahead in the distance. Hey, there's the cave from before. If we run, we could get there in a few minutes. Do you think we'd make it? I asked, and Kurama squinted before quickly looking around. We may be able to, but it'd be safer if we took cover over there, she said, pointing towards an outcrop of sandstone where there appeared to be a small dip in the ground. Making a quick decision, we ran towards the sandstone outcrop, taking shelter in the small ditch-like area. Taking cover behind the outcrop. The wind picked up even more and visibility was almost zero. Wow, that really hit fast, I said, and she nodded, scooting back until her back was against the sandstone. Yeah, and it's really going to set us back a bit. Sandstorms like this can last a while, she said, letting out a sigh. Frowning, I reached into my bag. Well, we can just think of this as a break. We've been walking for a while and we wouldn't have made it to the land of fire today anyways. And quite frankly, I could use a break to get something to eat. What about you? Are you hungry? I asked, pulling out 2 small wrapped loaves of bread. Smiling slightly, she took one and unwrapped it before taking a bite. So, what do we do now? She asked. 20 minutes had went by, and the sandstorm only continued to rage on. Sitting next to her with my back against the wall, I shrugged. I guess we just relax. There's nothing else we really can do while stuck here like this, I said. And she sighed. Sitting in silence for a few seconds, I turned to Kurama. Hey, I've been meaning to ask, but what did you want to do after we reached the land of tofu? I mean, besides what's already been planned, I don't know what to do next, and I don't really want to be the only one deciding what we end up doing, I said, and she frowned, looking thoughtful. Well, if that's the case, we could always just travel around. I believe you mentioned getting jobs from people looking for help before. We could always do that. And to be honest, I haven't gotten to see how much everything has changed since I've been sealed. So, this would be a great time, she said, and I nodded in understanding. Yeah, we could do that. Just traveling around does seem like it could be fun. Plus, it would give us a chance to try the different foods, I said, and she smiled. Hey, you still have that scroll with your father's jutsu, don't you? She asked, and I nodded. Why don't you take a look at it? We have the time, and it would give you something to do while we wait for this sandstorm to pass, she said, and I frowned before shaking my head. Nah, to be honest, I was planning to wait until I learn Sage Mode. I can't really focus on two things at once, and something tells me both are going to take my full attention, I said, and she nodded. Well, mind if I take a look at the scroll then? You might not be interested in it right now, but I wouldn't mind seeing how your father did it, she said. And I hesitated for a few seconds before reaching into my bag. He probably wouldn't like the fact that you were trying to learn his jutsu. But here, I said, handing her the scroll. Taking it, she rolled her eyes. Yeah, well, he could get over it. After all, the only reason he knew his precious Rasengan was from studying my BJU bomb, she said before unraveling the scroll and beginning to study it, letting her eyes scan the paper. After a few minutes, she let out a low whistle. You know, your father must have had high expectations of you, she said, looking up from the scroll. Why, what do you mean? I asked, and she pointed to the paper. This is a high-level S-rank jutsu, one so complex that even he must have had a difficult time mastering it, yet he still had enough faith in you that he passed it on to you. He honestly believed that you'd be able to master it as well, she said, and I blinked before taking out my father's old kanai, absent-mindedly fiddling with it. Really, he really had that much faith in me? I asked, and she nodded. Yes, really. I have no doubt in my mind that he had great expectations that you would go far, she said. And I sighed slightly. Well, I must have let him down. Turns out I didn't really turn out how he expected, I said. And Kurama swatted me hard with her tail. Hey, knock that off. You're just starting off. Give it time. You've already managed to learn the Rasengan and BJU bomb. In my opinion, you're doing great. I'm sure he would have been proud of you, she said, and I gave her a weak smile. Pretty soon, the shadow of night began to creep across the desert sand, and the temperature began to drop. Hey, nah, why don't you get some sleep? The storm is obviously not going to stop anytime soon, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. What about you? I asked, and she shrugged. Well, someone's got to keep watch. I'll stay up and wake you when the storm stops or something happens, she said. And I looked at her for a few seconds before shrugging. If you're sure, then okay. But we're still far enough in the desert that we don't really have to worry about anyone bothering us. And plus, the sandstorm would prevent it anyways. Try to get some sleep, too, if you can, I said before reaching into my bag and grabbing a spare shirt and balling it up, setting it under my head, groaning slightly as I tried to get comfortable. Remind me to buy some blankets and pillows when we get to the village, I said, and she smirked, wrapping her tails around me before pulling me close to her until I was laying against her front. Why would you need all that when you have me? She asked, raising an eyebrow. As for pillows, you've got two right here, she said, letting my head rest against her, smirking back at her. I rolled my eyes, though I did enjoy the warmth of her fur against me. Yeah, what was I thinking? I asked sarcastically, and she rolled her eyes as well. Getting comfortable, I closed my eyes, and she smiled down at me before turning her gaze towards the opening of the small outcrop. After a while, Kurama gently shook my shoulder, and I flinched slightly before slowly opening my eyes. Looking around, I realized that the sun was up. Not only that, but the sandstorm had stopped. Time to wake up. Nah. I told you I'd wake you when the storm stopped. It stopped a little before sun up, but I decided to let you sleep, she said. And I thanked her before stretching and sitting up. After a few seconds, I turned towards her. Well, since the storm has stopped, are you ready to head out again? I asked, and she nodded. If we head out now and keep at a steady pace, we should get to about the edge of the land of fire by tonight, I said. So, we won't reach the village until tomorrow, she said. And I agreed. Right, so, If you're ready, let's start heading out, I said. And she once again nodded before following as we once again began heading for the Hidden Leaf Village. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto what if stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.